Hello guys. In a recent poll on my community tab, you guys voted by a very narrow margin for me to build the Tamiya Centaur as my next armour build. So that's what I did. If you're not familiar with the Centaur, it is essentially a early Cromwell tank. Externally, the Cromwell and the Centaur look virtually identical. The key difference is the engine they use, with the Cromwell having a much more powerful engine. Centaur saw limited action in World War II. The only ones to see combat use were used by the Royal Marines during the D-Day landings. Let's take a quick look at the Tamiya kit and then I'll tell you a bit more about the history of the Centaur in action as I build it. Interestingly, the side of the box here shows a Cromwell tank in a green paint scheme, but does point out that is not included in this kit. So it's a bit confusing there of Tamiya to put a picture of a Cromwell on the side of this, especially since it's so similar. But anyway, that's what they've done. I won't show you the whole box contents because you'll see them as we build it up. But let's have a quick flick through the instructions. The inside page tells us a brief history of the vehicle. The instructions are standard Tamiya fare, so I won't spend a huge amount of time on them. Just a couple of things to point out. Firstly, when we get to step 15 here, it's telling us to apply the decals. These are the distinctive degree marking decals that go around the side of the turret, and it wants us to put those on now so that we can add some pieces on top of that later on. So of course that's going to require us painting the base of the turret, gloss varnishing, putting the decals on, and then pre-painting those separate bits and then adding them on top. We've got two paint schemes. The first one here is the Royal Marines Armoured Support Group, 1st Armoured Support Regiment, 2nd Battery, H Troop, Normandy, France, 1944. This is the tank called Hunter, which is seen in some archive photos. Tamiya has us painting it in XF52, which is their flat earth colour. This is used to represent the British colour SCC2, which is a brown colour. I'm not sure if XF52 is particularly accurate, but we have several different options now for that colour, including AK real colour paints, which is what I'll be using on this. Our second option across the page, quite easy to miss because it's just a small diagram, is here. Also the Royal Marines Armoured Support Group. This is the 5th Independent Battery, also seen on D-Day. And as I mentioned in my poll, I'm going to add this Aber photo etch here for the deep wading adaptions for the Centaur. In reality, this is a really simple photo etch edition. It's simply a funnel that goes around the air intake at the rear, and another one that goes around the commander's hatch. I'm not quite sure why I've got these fingerprints here on this photo etch. Did I leave greasy fingerprints on it at some point when I put it away? Because it's such a simple addition, this doesn't require me to make any changes to the kit or to replace any kit parts with these photo etch parts. It's purely an addition, so I can put this aside until I've virtually finished the main tank. So let's get started with the construction while I tell you a bit more about the history of the Centaur. You'll notice I've started construction with the turret. The simple reason for that is I'm going to pose the turret with the hatches open and the two figures in, and therefore I need to build up the gun and the turret halves so I can paint the interior. So as I mentioned earlier, most Centaur tanks were not used in combat, but were used for training purposes. However, the Royal Marines Armoured Support Group did use them in combat, landing on D-Day. They used the close support version of the Centaur fitted with a 95mm howitzer. And the original plan, believe it or not, was for them to fire their weapons from the decks of landing craft and not to come ashore. However, shortly before the invasion, it was decided that they would fare better if the engines were retained and the vehicles could actually come ashore. Within 15 minutes of H hour, which was the start of the invasion, 20 Centaurs were ashore, and although originally they were only intended for use during the initial landing phase, they stayed in action for 15 days in total. As you can see here, I built up the wheels and the suspension arms for the tank. This is fairly standard Tamiya fare, meaning it fits perfectly, but you don't get the option to, for example, pose those suspension arms in slightly different positions like you might do on other kits. There are no real alignment issues for the armoured plates at the front and back, as they fit nicely onto the existing space. Here you can see the completed lower hull, with the road wheels left off of course for separate painting. It's quite a simple construction, as you might expect from a Tamiya kit. It goes together well, and that single piece upper hull really completes the general outline of the tank. Of course, on the front armoured plate we have the driver's vision hatch, which I'm going to pose open since that would make the most sense if it was driving along. The hatch is not big enough that we can see through it really and see the empty interior, so it's not such a problem. And here are the components of that turret after they've been given a coat of Tamiya grey primer and then a light coat of white. They can now be assembled. Then we deal with the very distinctive armour around the turret, and that just builds up with these thick plates. Of course there's lots to add to the upper hull. These stowage bins help give the tank a nice sort of bulky look, and I can see these taking some weathering, some chipping, maybe some metal showing through in places. Plus of course we've got all the usual items, the fire extinguishers, the tools, and so on. The only pieces I found slightly awkward were these rear mudguards, which didn't seem to have a very positive location point. One slightly unusual addition that we have is this plastic mesh here, which is designed to represent, I guess, metal mesh over the air intake at the rear of the tank. Luckily this mesh is still fairly stiff, and it was easy to cut it to size and superglue it into position. To be honest, that will be covered with the wading gear anyway, so it shouldn't be possible to see too much of that. The engine hatch is separate, so we could in theory pose it open, although of course there's nothing inside. And indeed the same here for the driver's hatch. The two figures that Tamiya give us are not that bad actually. They're not quite up to their modern standards of course, but they're still fairly decent. Most of the body is a single piece, so we don't have too much to worry about in terms of posing legs and so on, or gaps. And it's only either one or two of the arms which are separate. Here are the figures posed as the instructions would have us put them. However, of course, this is going to cause a problem for me in a moment because we're going to add this extra gear around the hatch. At this point we were ready for the photo etch. As I mentioned, it was a fairly straightforward process. Only the first section caused me a bit of trouble, and that's this section here around the hatch and the turret. If you notice, the instructions show that as a rectangle, going sort of across the screen as we look at it now, horizontally if you will. However, if we look at the turret, we can see that the hatch is in a vertical orientation, which doesn't quite match the instructions very well. The photo etch did bend very well because it has really nicely marked bending points, but yes, I did have to fiddle with that slightly and in the end remove a small amount of detail from around the hatch in order to make that one fit. And there's the final result of that. As you can see, it's not quite square, but it's the best I could do. No such problems with the main air intake at the rear of the tank. That bent perfectly. And because it's quite a large piece with a long edge, I found the best thing to do was not to glue it in place just yet, but to fold it into the approximate shape, and then to take the surrounding rectangular part and just push it over the top. And that has the benefit of keeping that into the rectangular shape so that I can just run some super glue on the end of a cocktail stick down the inside of that main seam. And that worked really well for me. This rear intake is going to be left separate for now because painting is going to be a bit difficult, particularly on the interior, so I want the ability to get the airbrush in from both the top and the bottom. We also have these U-shaped brackets that go on the rear deck, 2 per side. To be honest, I have absolutely no idea what these are for. I've seen something similar on Churchills, but of course they have air intakes on both sides of the engine. This doesn't. So I'm not quite sure what the intention of those is, but anyway, they're in the instructions, so on they went. Tamiya supply us with this string for the tow cables. It's better than some string provided by some manufacturers, but I'm still not a huge fan of it, so I replaced it with this metal wire that I had just laying around. The disadvantage of this wire is it's quite thick, so it's quite hard to bend it, but nevertheless I still think it looks better than the string. In fact, it is quite reluctant to go down, and so I had to use a fair amount of super glue on this, as well as some clamps to hold it in place overnight. Strangely, all the photos of the Cromwell seem to show the tow cables on the hooks at the front, and then just laid on the deck at the side, rather than going round something and back to the front hooks, or all the way over to the rear hooks, or anything like that. The last thing to add is this PE bracket on the right hand side. I'll throw a couple of jerry cans in there later. I always keep the leftover photo etch fret. I always think things like these small lines here could be quite useful as perhaps rifle straps for figures. I wanted to make a cover for the gun mantlet because that's often seen in reference photos. I cracked out the mini-put and mixed the 2 parts together, but I think this is past its sell-by date because it just did not seem to want to mix properly. So I used my cheap epoxy that I found somewhere else, cut a rough rectangular patch and threw it on the front of the turret, and then sort of sculpted it into place there to look like some fabric. That's not too bad, I think. Adding that gun mantlet cover marked the end of the build process. I was going to paint the Centaur in this video as well, but I simply ran out of time, so that will have to take place in a future video. For now, I'll leave you with the tank after it's been primed and given a coat of XF1 black on the lower portions, plus some panel line pre-shading of black on the upper surfaces. This will hopefully act as a pre-shading layer for the main coat of paint in the next video. Finally, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for watching. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. I've got lots more content coming up, so I hope to see you in a future video. You can check out updates on my YouTube community page or on Instagram, where my username is model.nerd. Thanks again for watching, and until my next video, have fun modelling.